We're going to begin on page number 20. Page number 20. And, of course, as we're traveling through this material, there will be at different points in time a specific Bible reference to the fulfilling of a prophecy or a reference to, as we'll see here later on, and will give us an opportunity to talk about it relative to the development of various things that existed in Judaism outside of what was specified in the law of Moses. And one of the things that especially people who are on the left-leaning side of things, you know, those that are not really appreciative of the restrictions that God's Word places on them, they will use some of the things that transpired during this 400 years in which God was silent. He was not providing any additional revelation. But that's, of course, not saying that nobody had any instruction to follow, because they did. There's just nothing being added to it. The law of Moses was still operative. What God expected the children of Israel still stuck, you know. Just because there are no prophets that are making prophecies concerning the future, and while there are certainly fulfillment of prophecies that had been made, then people are still obligated to the law under which they were obligated prior to the silence, you see. Just because, let me think about from a standpoint of our country, you know. There have been times down through history in which there have been amendments added to the Constitution, okay? And the only way that those amendments would be operative is after they have been made part of the Constitution, not before, you know. Now, you might can look back on situations that existed prior to that and say, well, it shouldn't have took that long. Well, that's neither here nor there, you know. Or you might look at situations and say, well, that shouldn't have ever took place, you know, like women getting to vote, the very idea, you know. I actually heard a fellow claim to be a gospel preacher one time, said since women started voting, it's been downhill ever since, you know. And he wasn't using it in a favorable way either, you know. And of course, that type of mentality exists, still exists. I guarantee there's people that still think that. But that don't make it right, see. Just because people have that idea. And when we're talking about the government of the United States of America, we're not talking about a divine arrangement, obviously. While we're thankful for it, we're thankful for the system that we live under, we know that it did not originate in heaven. Now, that's a whole lot different than the law that was given to the descendants of Abraham through Isaac through Jacob, the law of Moses. It was from heaven, just as Christianity is from heaven. And so we have a law that we are obligated to follow, and they did too. They did too. So don't ever jump to a conclusion and say, well, since there was no additional revelation being provided, then they could just do what they wanted to do. No, they couldn't. They were still under obligation to do what God would have them to do. Now, we're going to end up asking some questions later on about developments during this period of time. For example, well, yeah, go ahead. I mentioned it, so I might as well go ahead and bring it up. When it comes to authority, Bible authority, we understand, or at least hopefully we do, from passages like Colossians chapter 3 at verse 17. Whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, okay? So that idea, that concept of whatever we do in life is to be authorized, that is sanctioned by God's Word. Now that includes all the thou shalt and thou shalt not. You know, everything that we do is supposed to be based upon what God's revelation tells us to do. To follow in the footsteps of Jesus is not to go to the Middle East, you know, and walk down the streets of Jerusalem. No, it's to follow His example, His inspired example that we have in Scripture recorded for us to do that very thing. And when it comes to authority, when a matter is determined to be authorized, then, and really only then, do you start figuring out an expedient way to do that which is authorized. In other words, you can't have an expedient way to do something that's not authorized, okay? So once you establish Bible authority for a matter, then you start to determine what's the most expedient way for us to do that. Now, we're going to be talking about that later on in the month with the seminar that we're going to have about evangelizing. I mean, there's no doubt about it that not only are we authorized to take the gospel to a lost and dying world, We're obligated. But the question is, how? How do we do that, Are we restricted to the examples of individuals and how they did it in the first century? Well, of course not, The responsibility and the authority is to go. Now, how you go, that's a matter of judgment. What's the best way to do it, If I want to go and do mission work, as I am required to do mission work, if I want to go to do mission work in Africa, do I have to take a boat? Well, that would be a very inexpedient way to get to Africa, It might take forever, and that might be one of the reasons why I want to go there, is because it takes so long that by the time I get there, I may have my courage built up by then, to be able to do it. But the most expedient way is the way that's the most advantageous for what you're trying to accomplish. It's not advantageous to spend months getting somewhere when you could get there in a day's period of time, And we're not talking about people scared of flying or anything like that. That doesn't figure into this scenario we're talking about. We're talking about expedience. But as we'll see in looking at what transpired during this 400-year period, there was the development of something called a synagogue. And there was also a feast that was developed as well that we're going to be seeing a little bit of today. And both of those things, if you were to be asked for authority for those things from the law of Moses, is there authority for that? Where is the specific authority for a synagogue? Where is the specific authority for the celebration of this feast day that came along with some courageous Jews in the city of Jerusalem in the around 150 BC, Now, here's the thing. A few years ago, because of people's inability to admit that you have to have Bible authority for things, people would start making arguments like, we don't have authority for a church building. There's no Bible authority for a church building. Is there Bible authority for a church building? If there's not, then we need to vacate the premises immediately. Because if we're doing something which is not authorized, then we're sinning. But there is authority for a church building. From one simple passage of Scripture, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together as a manner some is, but exhorting one another, so much the more see they approach it. Are we authorized to meet, to assemble together? Well, sure. How are we going to assemble together? Now, it would be pretty cold today, and probably some people who would be sort of in the weak physical mode anyhow might catch a death cold today if they were having to meet out under a tree somewhere. So we are authorized to meet, which would include renting a building, building a building, meeting in somebody's house, or having what we have available here where a whole bunch of people can meet in the same place at the same time and enjoy much of the comforts of home. There is, if there's not Bible authority for a matter, then we don't have any business doing it. We don't have the authority to do it. And so there is authority for a church building. That would include everything that's necessary to go along with it. That includes toilet paper. That includes water. Includes anything and everything. A refrigerator to keep the grape juice from spoiling. All these things are authorized from the simple command to assemble together. Now, that shouldn't really be that difficult, and yet we got some people in the world and some people that are brethren who simply cannot get that principle understood. Do we have authority for Bible classes on Sunday morning? Do we have authority for Bible classes on Wednesday night? Well, it becomes a question of, is it right to study the Bible together? Well, it either is or it isn't. It's either authorized or it's not authorized. Surely nobody would take the position that it's not authorized to study the Bible together, Well, what about in our studying the Bible together? What if we all were in the same class? Would that be all right? Sure. Well, what about if we divided up? You had men in one class and women in another class. Well, I hope that's authorized because that's what we do. Or maybe we have a division of grades. You got kids that are learning with other kids and teenagers learning with other teenagers and young adults. Is there authority? Well, sure there's authority. If there wasn't, we couldn't do it. Obviously, there's authority for that. And when it comes to the synagogue it should have never been looked upon as a substitute for what God intended the people to do 3 times a year and going back to Jerusalem. But it was simply a means of carrying out the responsibility of keeping yourselves taught, of an opportunity to study together. And of course, bits and pieces of information that we have, and obviously from the Lord's participation in synagogue worship, that's a stamp of approval on it being acceptable right there. But as far as going back to the law of Moses, the law that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, and it's saying, oh yeah, by the way, when y'all are carried into captivity, you can develop a synagogue system. We didn't have to. When he commanded fathers to train their children, then that was a part of the authority. Is whatever means is available to do that, then obviously it's authorized. Now I know it might be hard for you to believe that down through the years we've had brethren who would draw lines of fellowship over matters just like this. They would say that us having individual Bible classes and divided up into individual groups, there's no authority for that. Well, sure there's authority for that, under the generic authority to study the Bible. And this is simply an expedient way to do it, Now, I would submit that the most expedient way to do it would not be to put me in charge of teaching the little babies, But would there be authority there for me, if necessary, to teach little babies? Well, sure. Sure. So that principle is one that needs to be under. And here's the reason why I brought that up. Some people will say that because we don't see the synagogue system spelled out in the law of Moses, then it was an addition, and thus it was sinful, or it was allowed even though it was an addition, and so we shouldn't get all bent out of shape when people are coming up with additions today. That's their reasoning. See? Well, the fact of the matter is it wasn't sinful. It was allowable because the general principle to teach is authorized. How you go about doing that? Exactly. They were in you've got to really commend them for coming up with a way to keep themselves taught while they were in less than ideal circumstances, enslaved to foreign powers, Whether you're of course, very few probably in the northern kingdom of Israel were concerned about preserving anything, but there was probably a few that were. And then, of course, as they were carried into Assyrian captivity, then what are you going to do in captivity? Well, I know what some people do. Say, well, it's like this girl one time, I was talking to her, and she'd been at Knoxville for a year, and she was going back to school up there, and I said, what congregation are you attending while you're up there? She said, well, I've just not ever got around to hunting one. I said, you've been up there a year. I bet you know where the local McDonald's is. I bet you know where to go and get clothes. You mean to tell me you've been up there a year and you've never ventured out to find a congregation to worship with? You'll be kidding me. Well, I reckon maybe sometimes people think, well, if I'm at Knoxville and not at Dunlap, then whether I go to service or not don't matter. Well, it does too. Ain't got nothing to do with where you happen to be. It's your responsibility as an individual, and this girl was a member of the church, of all things, for her to find a place and a group of people to worship with, because there's a plenty there available to do it. But that just never did come up. So the children of Israel took the same position, well, we're in captivity, so we're not going to be concerned about that law of Moses business while we're here. Now, if it actually happens like Jeremiah said, and we'll be out of this place in 70 years, then we'll pick back up and start doing what God wants to do then. That's not the way it works, Is that the attitude that Daniel had? I won't worry about these dietary restrictions that God placed on us in the law of Moses. I'm going to go ahead and eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. Now, he didn't do that. Why not? Because he was a man of conviction and character, and he could be that right in the midst of a heathen society. And then when that heathen society is supplanted by another heathen society, then he can stand out above the rest as well, even in the Medo-Persian Empire too. So it's possible. All right. The last Ptolemies. Now, the little hint that I have to use to differentiate between these two main groups, the descendants of these two main generals of Alexander the Great. The Seleucids came from Syria. They were the Syrian kings, and the Ptolemies centered in Egypt. And you would think maybe, if you've got one leader and his kingdom is divided amongst four generals, then those four generals and their descendants will get along well. That's not right. That's not what happened, because they're constantly vying for position and territory and end up fighting each other. Now, not immediately upon the death of Alexander the Great, but as time goes on, they certainly do. And so we're introduced here in Roman numeral number 3 here to a fellow by the name of Ptolemy Euergetes. And the way he gets his name, of course, is because one of the wars which led him beyond somebody says, well, that's not the Euphrates River. Well, if you speak what they spoke, then maybe it sounds more like it than me, the Euphrates River. And amazingly, when he did this, he captured and placed in their temples in Egypt some of the statues that the Egyptians had, of course, made that had been carried into captivity by others previous to them. And these are old trinkets from previous civilizations, which, of course, reminds us that when how many times that the king in Samaria or the king in Judah and Jerusalem at the time would empty out the storehouses, and send all their gold to Assyria or somewhere to keep from being attacked, So that gold and all those precious things were floating around from one group to another group, stolen. So it really doesn't surprise us then when we still read about Nazi gold and Nazi treasures, and that's something that didn't just originate with the Nazis, still in fine paintings and stuff like that. That's been going along as long as there has been men, and seeing the value in those things to take advantage of. Excuse me. And notice down here, letter C. And the specifics of these guys' names is not really that important, but what they did do is somewhat important. During his reign, Antiochus III, who was the 6th in the line of the generals from Syria, Seleucid ruler in Syria, he was immortalized on this stone. And I know that when we studied a few years ago, and I know that we did in the teenage class, we listened to Kyle Butt, I think it was Kyle, on a video. And of course, this Rosetta Stone actually identifies these individuals and others, historical figures, which testifies to their existence and all. And we saw as well when we're studying the divided kingdom how that secular history even makes mention of many of these rulers that we know existed and are mentioned in the Bible for sure. And notice what it says. He was immortalized on the Rosetta Stone. What does immortalized mean? Made immortal? Well, how is he made immortal by Rosetta Stone? Well, it's going to be protected, set in some fancy museum somewhere probably, and his name's always going to be there. That's what immortalized means. Of course, that's a very specific use of the term immortalized for sure. But it says here that he was named. It was named, this Rosetta Stone, was named for a town in the Nile Delta near where it was found by, of all things, Napoleon's men in the year 1799. So there's a piece of rock that goes back centuries many, many years. And what's significant about it is because it's written in 3 different languages, then by the process of comparison, then you can figure out how to read hieroglyphics if you know what words are being used. I mean, it's like if you've got dog in English, dog in Spanish, and dog in German, then you can figure out the letters that goes along with each, or at least by sight words, what word being used in this language that you hadn't got a clue as to what it is. And so, of course, that's what happened, with the Enigma code that the Nazis used in World War II. Somebody hit on the brilliant idea. Look at this. Every message that sent the last 2 words on there is the same. I reckon what that was. Or Heil Hitler. Heil Hitler, yeah. So they figure, we know what those letters are then, And, of course, they ended up developing over that period of time to figure out that language. That whole system, of course, was used by inspired writers as well in the New Testament book of Revelation, The figurative language that was used was for the purpose of conveying a message to the friends of Christianity and concealing it from the enemies of Christianity. And so here's a Roman soldier who's trying to make sense of all the signs and the symbols that are used in the book of Revelation and said, I can't figure out nothing. He said, well, that's the purpose, If you understood Daniel and Ezekiel and Zechariah, and you might know a little bit more about what we're trying to get across here. And so this huge stone was granite, 4 feet by 2 feet and a half foot by 1 foot, and it was inscribed in hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek capital letters. And so if this was made all the way back in 200 BC, then you can see how the significance of this as it plays this historical verification role of that period of time, and of course what he's doing as he's engaged in idolatrous worship, obviously. He's expressing gratitude for favors and some matters of current events in that particular scroll. And then, of course, at the bottom of the page, somebody that we do know a little bit about, Elizabeth Taylor, better known as Cleopatra. She was the last of this dynasty, ruling all the way up to 30 BC. And so you see we're getting right here close to the days of John the Immerser and the days of Christ. Now notice on the top of the next page, and this is the same principle that gets repeated pretty well since the Medo-Persians beat the Babylonians. The Jews seem to have been left to their own pursuits, except for what? Except for having to pay taxes, And of course, all the Robin Hood shows that I've ever seen, they were allowed to do what they wanted to do as long as they gave the sheriff of Nottingham a big old bag of gold, But of course, then they end up starving to death and you have war and all that. But as long as you're keeping your nose clean and paying the taxes, you can do what you are supposed to be doing. And so here's a priest by the name, high priest by the name of Simon the Just. Now, where did that begin, If you had, if names were used correctly, then if you got Simon the Just, then before him there was a Simon the Crook, and after him there was a Simon the dishonest person, But anyhow, here's a guy that's designated as that, evidently from the reputation that he had. And interestingly, he's credited with doing the job that had been done previously by Nehemiah in rebuilding the walls around the city of Jerusalem. So, and he also developed this cistern system and this water holding place, a reservoir, where they would have adequate water supply in the case they were, of course, attacked and surrounded by invading armies. And, of course, that come in handy later on for sure. And then Josephus, of course, Jewish historian, notice what he says here in this section here from Antiquities. Now it happened that in the reign of Antiochus the Great, who ruled over all Asia, that the Jews, as well as the inhabitants of Cilicia, and so you see Syria and Cilicia, suffered greatly, and their land was sorely harassed. For while he was at war with Ptolemy Philopator, and with his sons, who was called Epiphanes, it fell out that these nations were equally sufferers, both when he was beaten and when he beat others, so that they were like a ship in a storm, which is tossed by the waves on both sides. And just thus were they in their situation in the middle between Antiochus' prosperity and its change in adversity. And so it's just, I mean, it sounds like life, you know. On a good day, dealing with somebody like that, if we're successful, then it'll be good for you. But on days in which they're facing adversity or attacked by enemies or somebody's out to kill them, then don't be surprised if it's like going home, had a bad day at work, and you kick the dog, you know, or do something silly like that, except you're dealing with people who are in a position of power that can make your life miserable, which is exactly what they did. Then we get to the Seleucids on page 22. Let's jump down to letter C, and hopefully you're reading all this and maybe doing some cross-referencing as you do it. I'd suggest that you do it with a Bible, and also a dictionary that'll help you some as well. There were two factions that developed, a pro-Egyptian faction and a pro-Syrian faction. Now, can you see how that over time, the same type of problems, same type of difficulties that have always existed among men, they make their way into the leadership group, obviously, in the city of Jerusalem. And of course, this matters because of the foundation that's being laid for all these things, both political and spiritual, for when the Lord comes on the scene and makes the gospel available to the totality of lost mankind. And so notice it says the Syrian king, who had no business sticking his nose in this at all, you know. I mean, they're paying their taxes, leave them alone. He replaced the Jewish high priest with his brother, with a fella who was a Hellenizer. And what is a Hellenizer? All right, somebody that's promoting that way of life, the Greek way of life, the language, all the things that are peculiar to the Hellenization of the world at that time. And of course, he was trying to turn the city from being a Jewish city to being a Greek city. Now, that's going to take a whole lot, you know. And of course, by force, you can accomplish a whole lot of things. But with force, you can't accomplish everything you intend to do, because, I mean, the principle of fear not him that kills the body but is not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him who's able to destroy both soul and body in hell, you know. And the example is of faithful people who in terrible situations remain faithful nonetheless. And so what you have here in this period of time is what the writer here says is one of the darkest days of Israel's existence. And here's what happened. A systematic attempt was made to Hellenize the country before us. An edict demanded the fusion of all the nationalities of the empire into one people. Greek deities were to be worshipped by all. Wait a minute. What if there is a royal decree that comes down from headquarters, whatever headquarters might be, and says, listen, you're going to have to bow down to this statue of Nebuchadnezzar? Can you do that? I mean, that's the law of the land. You can't do that. Just because the law of the land don't mean it's allowable by God. You don't have any authority to do that. You can have authority to worship a heathen deity or a heathen king or a heathen anything, see? And there is no authority. And the thing is that if these individuals had been taught their history, then they knew that God's faithful had refused to succumb to the temptation to go along to get along, you know. You know, here, have you ever thought about, and have you ever contemplated the choice between dying a slave or living, or dying a free man or living as a slave. You know, what would we do? What would you do? You know, and the thing is, we don't have any black and white answers for all situations, because we know that Paul himself could have hung around at various places and been killed for sure, but he escaped. You know, if we take the position that he should have just gone ahead and gone into eternity and been thankful that he escaped the persecution, then we're questioning his decision, and we're questioning the benefit that was derived from him going to other places and being able to preach the gospel and write all these letters to him. Remember, it was Paul that said, you know, for me, it'd be better off if I just died, but for you, it'd be better if I stayed around here for a while, you know. So a judgment call for sure in situations like that. So here's what happens. An elderly Athenian philosopher was sent to Jerusalem to supervise the enforcement of this order. And what's this order? You're going to worship these Greek gods, little gods. He identified the God of Israel with Jupiter, and he ordered a bearded image of the pagan deity, perhaps in the likeness of Antiochus, set up on the temple altar. The Jews popularly spoke of this as the abomination of desolation. Oh, wait a minute, I remember that. Now, that abomination of desolation is a prophecy, a pre-written historical statement that's made by Daniel. And while they applied it to that situation there, it really didn't apply to this situation here, because we see it being used by inspired writers in the first century to refer to the surrounding of the city of Jerusalem by the Romans and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. So while they may have thought, okay, this is it, you know, it's like whenever you have a prediction that is made and then an inspired man says this is that, like Joel and Peter saying that in Acts chapter 2, then you know it is. And while they might have thought there was good reason to think that this has got to be it, I mean, if this is not defiling everything that's holy and good about the temple and the worship of God by bringing in all these heathen deities and us supposed to bow down to them and all, if this is not the abomination, what is the abomination of desolation, you know? Could it be a type of? Well, sure, you know. Does it meet all the criteria? No, not all the criteria, but it resembled it to the point where they thought this had to be it. And of course, remember too, that they're left up to their own thinking to try to put this puzzle together, to make these dots fit, you know. They don't have inspired help to do that. And thus that's the decision, or that's the conclusion that they drew. Notice Greek soldiers and their paramours performed licentious heathen rites in the very temple courts. And of course, that paramours is just a civilized, better way to refer to prostitutes than to just say prostitutes. Swine were sacrificed on the altar. What? The drunken orgy associated with the worship of Bacchus was made compulsory. In other words, you had to participate. The Jews were forbidden under penalty of death to practice circumcision. They were forbidden from observing the Sabbath day or the observance of any of the feast days of the Jewish year. And if there were any copies of the old law, then they were to be destroyed. Now that sounds like their freedom to worship as they saw fit is no longer in existence. And of course it's not, you know. So here's a bad situation for people just wanting to be faithful, you know. And of course, it was difficult. Then notice the next thing he says, a gymnasium. Reckon what that was? A gymnasium. That had an adjoining racetrack was built. And can you imagine, here are these Jewish kids who are having to exercise in the way that the Greeks exercised, which had the tendency to outrage who? Pious Jews, which is, in essence, anybody that knew you're not supposed to be doing this stuff. Because most of the time when they were doing this exercising, they were not concerned about modesty at all. Most of the time involved in these, I mean, if you've got out and out sexual acts taking place in the worship of these deities, then you're obviously not concerned about having on adequate clothing when you're out here running and trying to get in shape, you see. And so, and I guarantee you there were people there that looked upon the pious Jews as old fuddy-duddies, you know. You don't want us to have any fun. You don't want us to enjoy ourselves. Come on, get with it, you know. It's modernize yourself. Your mind's too connected to the past, you know. Boy, time ain't really changed at all, has it? Yeah. Same type of things that we experience even today. And so obviously, the Hellenizing of the Jewish race was attempted for sure. And then on the top of the next page, and we'll have to quit there, the Jews who opposed this were called the Hasidim. And of course, as time goes on, they develop into, or they are the forerunners of the Pharisees. So if a group of people in a situation like that they start banding together in opposition to all these changes that are not just changes for the sake of changes. These are changes right at odds with what you know the law of Moses tells you to do as his chosen people. Then it's not just another way to look at things. It's the wrong way to look at things. And for them to dig their heels in and say, we're not going to do that, you have to commend them. Because they were going against the majority for sure. They weren't just going along with the flow. And so the development of, or the forerunner position of the Pharisees, good idea to begin with, you know, and then over time develops into not too good idea. But at the beginning, and their desire to simply be faithful was obviously something to be commended. So here you got this example of a pig being offered right there in the temple. Well, what's the significance of that anyhow? Unclean. I mean, that's terrible. I mean, you could not more defame the temple than to do what they were doing right there. Everything that was condemned on the outside was participated in right there in the midst of the most holy place of the Jews' religion. And then, of course, we'll end up hearing about some heroes, Lord willing, as we continue on Wednesday evening. Thank you so much. Any comments, any questions? Oh, yeah. They call them Hasidic Jews. Yeah. Hasidim.